All right, conflict on the frontier. Basically the Texas West after the Civil War. After the Civil War, as we move through Reconstruction, it's important to note that there were not many Indians or Native Americans still living in the eastern portion of Texas. However, there were many bands and tribes of Indians living in western Texas. And of course, the most feared of those tribes was the Comanche, but there was also the Apache and Kiowas and several other groups as well. And during this time of Reconstruction in the East, especially when Texas was rebuilding, at least socially and economically after the Civil War, there were many raids and attacks by Indians in the western portion of the state. So one of the reasons, or actually many of the reasons, for the Indians raiding in West Texas, first of all, there were simply too few troops posted at the forts. So during the Civil War, of course, many Texas men joined the Confederacy and were really concerned about United States military forces in the eastern portion of Texas and northern portion of Texas, but not too concerned with what's going on in western Texas, simply because there aren't many settlements in West Texas. After the Civil War, when the U.S. Army takes over, during the Civil War, the U.S. Army had increased in size from 16,000 men to over 1 million men to fight the Civil War, especially along the East Coast. But within just 5 or so years after the Civil War, however, the U.S. Army was again sort of a very small organization of about 25,000 men. So there simply weren't many soldiers to send to West Texas at first, because the United States had obligations for its military forces in different areas of the United States, as far as, first of all, the Reconstruction, but also guarding the Canadian border and guarding the Pacific Northwest and other areas as well. So there weren't many troops to send. And second of all, the forts themselves were somewhat far away from each other. As we'll see, basically from Fort Griffin in the Panhandle to Fort Concho, sort of towards San Antonio, was a distance of 140 miles. And although 140 miles can quickly be traveled today by vehicles traveling 60 or 70 miles per hour, or by aircraft flying at 500 miles an hour, when you're on horse or a mule, you do not quickly travel that distance. It takes several days to move from fort to fort. So it's really hard for these forts to support each other in case anything happened in their area. There's also a shortage of supplies. There's a lot of the supplies and food and other necessities were being sent to military forces that were working during Reconstruction in the American South. So there weren't many additional supplies, and of course the supply route was rather long to get to many West Texas forts, and that supply route was, of course, oftentimes at the mercy of the Indians attacking the supply animals and the supply wagons themselves. Besides all that, the officers in charge of the fort were generally not used to fighting with Indians. They were usually fighting traditional battles. Some of them, of course, had come from the Civil War, where you had these large-scale affairs and armies basically marching quick, basically right up to each other and basically blasting each other away. And so oftentimes the officers themselves were not really acquainted with Indian tactics. You also have the fact that immediately after the Civil War, for the most part, especially in West Texas, you're still dealing with muzzle-loading guns, the muskets. And usually took 20 to 30 seconds to reload, so you can get off 2 or so shots a minute. Of course, the Indians would be showering you with many arrows in those in that minute that you were, getting off your 2 shots. Now, eventually, you would have different types of rifles and guns coming into West Texas. But at first, you had these muzzle loading guns that were sort of inadequate to the task, and the Indians basically had superior firepower at first. So there were a lot of reasons why after the Civil War, you really had the Indians basically having the advantage in West Texas. Of course, during the Civil War, most of those forts had been abandoned anyway, and the Indians, for 4 or 5 years, had basically sort of been doing what they wanted to and raiding where they wanted to, and so immediately after the Civil War, the Indians were not inclined to stop doing that. So you can see here on the map, you can see the different forts. You can see Fort Griffin, Fort Concho, 140 miles or whatever distance from each other. So you had these routes that some forts were on. And of course, we often think of the forts as, from TV movies, as basically behind wooden walls. And you had a big high fence guarding your fort. And the soldiers were standing at the top of the wooden wall shooting down. But oftentimes, West Texas forts were not that way. They were basically sort of open areas, basically with buildings serving as barracks and as hospitals and as houses for the officers, etc. Although generally it didn't matter, because generally the Indians would not attack a large group of armed soldiers, because that would inflict heavy casualties on the Indians. So even if the forts did not have those nice big walls that we're all used to in the movies, generally the Indians did not attack the forts themselves. So eventually, after the Civil War, the United States gets many different Indian groups together in Kansas and makes a treaty called the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek, where the U.S. government and the Indians make a peace treaty. Well, that's sort of the story, at least. So first of all, we need to understand that the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek wasn't really one treaty. It was several treaties sort of similar and made with different groups of Indians. So there were really sort of 3 treaties in one. So one treaty was with the Kiowa and Comanches, who were somewhat related. Another was with the Plains Apache Indians, and a third was with the Arapaho and Cheyenne Indians. And so each of these treaties was a little bit different. Plus, you also had the fact that each of these tribes, like the Comanches, was not just one big Indian group. It was actually composed of many different groups. If you think about the United States of America, the United States of America is certainly one country, but we have 50 states in that country. So it's almost like that. The Comanches were known as Comanches sort of by the Anglos and outsiders, but the Comanches were divided up in different bands, basically different subgroups, as were most of the other Indian tribes. So not all of these subgroups were present at the Medicine Lodge Creek Treaty. And oftentimes, simply because one subgroup signed didn't mean the other subgroups agreed with that. And generally, each of these subgroups or bands, as they were oftentimes called, had a very charismatic leader, a chief, so to speak. Simply because your chief happened to sign this treaty does not mean those other bands of Comanches are going to say, oh yeah, because Mr. Beck's band of Comanches signed the treaty, I think we'll all sign. No, not in reality. In much the same way as states quarrel today with each other in the United States, the bands often quarreled with each other as well. So in the Treaty of Medicine Lodge Creek, basically the Indians agreed to live on reservations. They agreed that they would basically be confined into an area, although it was supposed to be a very large area, and they would become farmers, as opposed to basically going out and hunting buffalo and raiding. And while this was going on, because it took many years to become a good farmer, you weren't going to become a good farmer next year, or the year after that, or the year after that. So it takes many years of being a farmer to actually be a good farmer and be able to grow crops that will feed not only yourself but others. And so during this time period, while the Indians had agreed to become farmers, the U.S. government was going to give them supplies. The U.S. government was going to feed them and make sure they were taken care of. And the reservations were going to be closed to non-Indians. That means we would, you and I, or our families could just wander in the reservations and look around, or come in and go hunting on the reservation property. That was Indian property, Comanche reservation or Kiowa reservation or whatever. And so the U.S. Army agreed to keep others out of those reservations. And while the Indians were becoming farmers, they would be given food and supplies to live on, so they wouldn't die in the process. So most Indians by this time realized that because of the growing, expanding population in the United States, because of immigration, also because buffalo were sort of dying out naturally as well, that it would not be possible to have the same type of lifestyle they had had in the past. And Indians were saddened by that, but the Indians were not stupid. They realized that if you tried to hang on to something that was dying out, you're going to die out. And so the Indians were willing to change, but they needed this help while they transformed themselves into a different type of economic society. Unfortunately, neither side really kept the treaty. So again, because not all of the band of the Comanches or Kiowas, etc., were at the meeting, when news got back that one band of the Comanches had signed it, some of the other bands said, well, we're not going to sign that stupid treaty. We're going to go on hunting buffalo and raiding. One of those groups was led by the infamous and famous, eventually, Quanah Parker, who continued to raid. Of course, Quanah was the son of an Anglo woman who herself had been captured by the Indians earlier on, and the Indian had captured her, basically married her, and they produced some kids, and one of those kids was Quanah, and he grew up to be an Indian chief. And he always remembered his mother very fondly, and he also remembered that one day the white man, the Anglos, came and took his mother away, and he was never too happy about that, and remembered that, and was, even though he was a very intelligent person, that anger still sort of dwelt within him for a very long time. But it wasn't just the Indians that was breaking their promises. The government often did not deliver supplies they were supposed to, and that was for various reasons. Sometimes the person the U.S. government put in charge of the reservation was not the most honest person. Sometimes those leaders of the reservation, those government leaders, would basically just steal the money and leave, and nobody would have any money to buy the supplies with. Or sometimes the government official at the reservation would take part of the money and then sort of buy substandard supplies, or not enough food, for example, for all the Indians, and then say, oh, this is all the money they sent. This is all the food they sent. Sorry. So the U.S. government would often break their promises as well, especially because of some very unscrupulous, some very dishonest government employees. So naturally, when the Indians did not get their food, they often went out to raid because, well, they needed to eat. As these raids sort of continued after Medicine Creek, General Sherman, who had been one of the major generals in the United States Army in the Civil War, came out to Texas for a little visit to see what the problem was. And in May of 1871, he arrived at Fort Richardson. But just a day later, on the same road that General Sherman had taken the day before, a wagon train was attacked, and 7 of those people were killed. So if General Sherman had been a day later, he might have been the one that was killed. So even the encounter was known, as the Battle of Warner Wagon Train Massacre, whatever. The guy's name was Warner, the guy the wagon master whose wagons it was, and so they named it the massacre after him. I guess it depends on what your idea of a massacre is and how many people it takes to have a massacre. But nevertheless, General Sherman was not exactly pleased to realize that he could have been one of the ones killed. And so he telegraphed back to the War Department to send additional troops and basically asked General Grant to send additional Army troopers and supplies to basically move the Indians back on their reservations by force. So many of those troopers that General Grant, now President Grant, sent were called Buffalo Soldiers. These were African-American soldiers, many of them newly freed men right after the Civil War. And of course, some of the newly freed men now no longer had jobs for, of course, reasons we discussed during Reconstruction. And so they took what jobs came along, and one of the jobs that came along was being a soldier. Because the job paid, but it also paid because you got a roof over your head and food to eat, which if you stayed maybe in one of your states that was being reconstructed as an African American, you might not have food to eat, and you might not have a roof over your head. So many of these men joined the Army, and also because of the fact that they had read stories and heard about or been told about stories about how during the Civil War, close to 200,000 African Americans had fought very bravely for the U.S. Army against the Confederacy for the United States. And they, many of these African Americans had heard these stories and said, hey, I might want to do this. This sounds like a great tradition to start. To fight for my country, especially the country that freed me from slavery. And why they're named Buffalo Soldiers, there's some dispute about exactly why, but apparently the sort of tough curly hair that they had at the time that was sort of in style at the time, the Indians sort of saw that sort of tough curly hair and sort of connected it with buffaloes, and the Indians started calling them Buffalo Soldiers. Is probably more or less the true story, or one of the main reasons why they were called the Buffalo Soldiers, although there are a few other stories that might also have impacted why they were called that. So the Buffalo Soldiers, again, also in the Indian Wars, fought very bravely. In fact, 13 at least, won the Congressional Medal of Honor during about 10-year period fighting the Indian Wars. The Buffalo Soldiers fought in over 177 skirmishes and battles in several states with the Indian Wars. Probably about 1 in 5 of cavalry troopers, of U.S. cavalry troopers that fought in the Indian Wars, as they were called, was an African American. And so again, the African Americans proved themselves very brave and oftentimes very talented fighters, not just during the Civil War, but after the Civil War in this time period as well. So the Buffalo Soldiers, along with other soldiers, of course, many Irishmen, perhaps we'll get in that in U.S. history, would also fight in the Indian Wars. And their main job was basically to pursue the Indians and make sure they went back on the reservations and didn't leave again to go out and raid. One way the Army determined to keep the Indians on the reservation was basically to destroy the buffalo herds, which apparently had been dwindling sort of in the past anyway. But now the Army made a concerted effort, the U.S. government made a concerted effort to basically wipe the buffalo herds out, because if there were no buffalo to hunt, the Indians probably would not leave the reservation as often, or maybe not at all. So it was a sort of a strategic move to keep the Indians on the reservation. And so the U.S. government hired buffalo hunters. They came out and shot buffaloes by the millions in great parts of the United States. The buffalo hides were often sent back to the East Coast, and the buffalo hides were made in many things, including clothing and other things that were sold not only in the United States but also in Europe as well. Unfortunately, of course, with all these buffalo dying, that really meant that the main food supply for the Plain Indians was dying as well. Again, it seems that the buffalo herds were dwindling anyway, but they certainly were not dwindling as fast as they did once these individuals paid by the U.S. government were shooting them at great numbers. Then they started dwindling and dropping very quickly. And of course, that would also, of course, make many Indians mad at the U.S. government as well. So the battle at Adobe Walls was related to these buffalo hunters. Indians leaving the reservations. If they had the chance to raid or kill people, they would love to kill buffalo hunters, because these buffalo hunters were basically, wiping out a way of life that had existed for the Indians for, thousands of years. And so at Adobe Walls, which is called Adobe Walls because there were walls made of adobe, that is clay bricks, and there are a few houses there where buffalo hunters wintered and stayed during the winter months. Quanah Parker would take about 500 to 700 Indians when he heard that there were some buffalo hunters there. At the time, there were 28, although during the three-day battle, I think a few more came to about 30 or so. Unfortunately, the battle of Adobe Walls not quite turned out like Quanah Parker wanted it to, because it showed that superior technology was going to help win the Indian wars, superior military technology, especially gun technology. So the Indians decided on a sort of a night attack, an early morning attack. Unfortunately for the Indians, some of the buffalo hunters were still up at that time repairing some of their adobe plate houses, and they saw and heard the Indians coming, and they pulled out their Winchester rifles. Unlike the musket rifles, which shot one or maybe two shots per minute, the rate of fire for Winchesters was probably about 20 bullets a minute. It was a great increase in firepower, and so the Indians were driven off. Of course, the Indians tried to come back and attack, but the buffalo hunters also had what's often called buffalo guns, but these are made by Sharp's rifle, and they are long-range weapons. In fact, just to prove the point that there were long-range weapons, the Indians, by the second day and third day, basically sort of were staying way back from this encampment because of this massive firepower from these Winchester rifles, which generally had a range of about 400, 500 yards. And so one of these Indians sort of rode up on a hill almost a mile away, just simply looked down, and one of the buffalo hunters, took his rifles. Hey, I wonder if I could, peg that Indian from here. And sure enough, he shot, and I think the range was about an 1/8 of a mile, almost a mile, and the buffalo hunter shot this Indian off the horse. And apparently as well, during one of the exchanges of firing, Quanah Parker was wounded, and so the Indians simply left. So I think there were only a few buffalo hunters killed, maybe 2 or so. And again, this is like 28 to 30 buffalo hunters holding up 700 Indians, and the Indians were armed with basically sort of muskets and those type of rifles as well as arrows. So they had guns as well, but they didn't have the nice Sharp's rifle, the long-range rifle. And this sort of showed that the superior military technologies could certainly help the Army win the war. And in fact, also at the time, they although it wasn't used at Adobe Walls, they also had lightweight cannon that could basically just be pulled by a horse, and the lightweight cannon could be didn't necessarily shoot out a cannonball, but it could shoot out a lot of almost like little small BBs or ball bearings to quite a distance, and basically just sort of wipe out everything in its path. and those lightweight cannons combined with long-range rifles, combined with massive superior firepower the Winchesters gave, certainly turned the tide as far as the weapons technology and as far as firepower was concerned for the U.S. Army. Oh, there's adobe walls. And okay. Another invention that helped the government win the West was the railroad. And the railroad is important because it could quickly bring people and supplies to an area. So again, riding on a horse is awesome and makes you feel free, and you sit high up, and it sort of makes you feel like you're the lord of the manor, the lord of all the range. However, a railroad goes much faster and brings a lot more supplies and men than one horse can, or even many horses can. And so with the introduction of the railroad into Texas, large numbers of supplies could quickly arrive in Texas and then sent by wagons and road networks to the American West. And of course, just over a short period of time, you're going to have railroads moving to the American West, to West Texas as well, and therefore you don't even have to worry about supply wagons. The railroad could simply, quickly bring large amounts of troops and large amounts of supplies to an area where the Indians might be attacking. So you can see by certainly 1880 or whatever, you have at least one railroad that goes all the way, basically from the eastern portion of Texas, almost all the way to the border with New Mexico in West Texas. And again, very useful for bringing supplies, very useful for bringing information, very useful for bringing in troops and cannons and other things that you might need in order to defeat Indian raids in an area. So by 1874, 1875, the Indians were being constricted. The Palo Duro Canyon, sometimes called the Red River Campaign, was the last significant military action against the Indians in Texas. And it was basically a series of attacks in the Panhandle. There are a series of battles, and basically the battles, the U.S. Army are bringing up superior firepower, including these little lightweight cannons. You have these Indians at first trying to defend their village, and of course, in battle after battle, the Indians loses, and then basically the Indians have to retreat. And as they retreat, the Army goes into these villages and burns supplies and burns the village down. And with a lack of supplies, it's going to be really hard for the Indians to mount an effective campaign against the U.S. Army. So even though few lives, as far as the Civil War had just been fought just a few years earlier, and over 700,000 Americans had lost their lives in that war. 1 out of 50 Americans, probably 1 out of every 25 males was killed in that war. So compared to the Civil War, very few lives were lost here in Texas in the Indian campaigns on either side. But the loss of villages, the loss of supplies, and especially the loss of horses, which the Americans, the Army would often round up, and if they didn't have the resources to take the horses away, perhaps by train, they would simply massacre the horses as well. And of course, with no means of transportation, and now with no means of supplies, that means the Indians are going to have to basically go where the U.S. Army wants them to go. So with little chance of surviving the winter, most of the Indians agreed to move back on the reservations and stay there. Of course, the Indians were not the only problem in West Texas or in Texas. Obviously, during Reconstruction after the Civil War, there were many problems. But there were also not just Indian raids, but there were also outlaw raids in the Rio Grande Valley. And especially in the Rio Grande Valley, you had a lot of these ex-Confederates who had sort of retreated there as a last resort. Some of them had gone across the Mexican border, then some of them came back across the Mexican border. So you had these ex-Confederates, you had some deserters from different armies in the area. There wasn't really a large law enforcement presence in the area. Of course, when the Civil War ends in Texas in 1865, all the Confederate Army and all the Confederate officials who might be keeping control of that area are now no longer authorized to do anything in that area. And then Union forces, when they're coming in, they're basically staying by the big cities to make sure that Reconstruction is in process. And they're also, of course, moving out west to West Texas to fight Indians. So there's not really many people to fight outlaws in the Rio Grande Valley. So the Texas governors start sending in the Texas Rangers, who had basically gotten their start in Austin's colony, sort of as scouts for the militia. But they became known as excellent riders. They became known as sort of the law enforcement part of the Texas government. They would eventually be scouts in several different military engagements, including the Mexican-American War. And so the Texas Rangers were sent in, and the outlaw activity in the Rio Grande Valley subsided quickly. Although, of course, there is a lot of disagreement about why the Texas Rangers were effective there. Some people would look at the Texas Rangers at the time and said, you know, they're nothing more than murderers, because oftentimes the Texas Rangers did not, when they moved into an area, they were not exactly the best judge and jury of who were the outlaws and who weren't the outlaws. And no doubt there were innocent people killed by the Texas Rangers. So there's disagreement about exactly how many people, innocents, were killed by the Texas Rangers, exactly why, and among historians, that debate sort of rages still in Texas history. But having said that, the Texas Rangers were pretty efficient at putting down the lawlessness in the valley within just a few years. So after the Civil War presented many challenges to Texas. Reconstruction was certainly the main challenge, but of course that was more economic and social, because of course Texas did not have no major battles because it didn't have to really rebuild. But then, of course, you also, at the same time as Reconstruction, and even as Reconstruction was ended, you had these outlaws in the valley, but you also had the Indian raids coming in from Oklahoma and northern Texas into West Texas. And so you had all this going on at once. So the time period after the Civil War was not exactly a boring time in Texas. It was a time where there was a lot of things going on for a lot of people, and not necessarily good things, but nevertheless, eventually order was more or less restored in the valley and in West Texas and in the Panhandle, and that would help Texas move west as far as more and more people starting more and more cities and more towns. So by the year 1900, West Texas had changed a lot. Basically because it had a greatly increased population. They were building many cities and towns, and these cities and towns were now connected by railroad and telegraph. So what had been sort of a wide open area with a lot of different people roaming back and forth and a lot of different areas of violence was now becoming a settled area within Texas and within the United States.